A general disappeared into a mountain while his army was breaking apart. Not missing, not captured, not wounded. Commanding. In February 1943, American soldiers were being driven back through the rocky gaps of western Tunisia. Tanks burned on the roads. Units lost contact with one another. Men who had crossed the Atlantic believing they were ready for the German army found out, in the worst possible way, that confidence is not the same as command. And 70 miles behind the fighting, Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall sat inside a headquarters his engineers had carved into a ravine. That distance became the story, because Kasserine Pass was not just America's first brutal lesson against the German army in North Africa. It became a test of whether Dwight Eisenhower could look at a disaster, name the real failure, and remove the man responsible before the next battle arrived. The pass itself did not look like a place where reputations would die. Kasserine was a rough opening through the Grand Dorsal Mountains of Tunisia, only about 2 miles wide, bare and exposed under the North African sun. But in February 1943, that opening became the place where German and Italian forces found the weakest seam in the Allied line and tore through it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and the Axis commanders understood exactly what they were attacking. The Americans were new. Their units were spread out. Their armor was often committed in pieces. Their command structure was tangled through British, French, and American authorities. And Second Corps, the American force standing in the path of the blow, was led by Fredendall. On paper, Fredendall had rank, authority, and experience. On the ground, his corps had something far more dangerous. It had a commander the front line could not feel. His headquarters was far behind the fighting, protected, elaborate, and physically removed from the men taking the shock. Combat engineers who were needed for military work had been used to dig and prepare the command site. Reports moved through layers. Orders moved through strange code phrases. Subordinate commanders received instructions that could be hard to interpret at the very moment they needed clarity most. At Kasserine, confusion was not an inconvenience. It was a weapon the enemy did not even have to manufacture. When the Axis assault opened, American positions began to bend. Then they broke. In a matter of days, U.S. forces were thrown back more than 50 miles. Tanks, guns, trucks, and men were lost in quantities the young American army had not yet experienced in the European war. More than 6,000 Americans were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Over 100 tanks were gone. Thousands of men who had been told they belonged to a modern army were suddenly trying to survive a defeat that exposed every gap between training ground confidence and battlefield reality. But the cruelest part was this. The American soldier had not simply failed. He had often fought with courage inside a system that did not give him the command, concentration, or confidence he needed. That distinction mattered to Eisenhower. Because if the soldiers were the problem, the solution was slow. Training, replacement, time. But if leadership was the problem, the solution could be immediate. Eisenhower was in Algiers when the reports hardened into a pattern. He was not blind to the scale of the humiliation. The British were watching. The Germans were measuring. Washington was waiting. And the American army, still trying to prove itself as a ground force, had just absorbed a public, painful defeat. Eisenhower could have protected the institution by spreading the blame so widely that no one man had to pay for it. Coalition confusion, inexperienced troops, difficult terrain, German veteran skill, bad intelligence. All of those things were real, but none of them explained why the commander of Second Corps seemed so far from the pulse of his own corps. So Eisenhower sent Omar Bradley to inspect the situation and report back plainly. Bradley was not theatrical. He was not Patton. He did not need thunder to make a judgment land. He moved through the corps, spoke with the division commanders, and listened for the thing every commander fears most. Not criticism, not anger. Lost confidence. When Eisenhower asked him what he thought of the command, Bradley's answer was direct. The condition was bad. The division commanders no longer trusted Fredendall as a corps commander. That was the line Eisenhower needed spoken aloud, because once a corps loses confidence in the man above it, every order arrives wounded. Even a correct order becomes suspect. Even urgency sounds like noise. Even discipline feels like punishment from a distance. And Kasserine had made the distance visible. British General Harold Alexander, now overseeing Allied ground forces in Tunisia, wanted Fredendall removed as well. The British had already been skeptical of American battlefield performance. Kasserine seemed to confirm their doubts. But Eisenhower had to be careful. He was not just moving pieces on an American map. He was managing an alliance, a war, a reputation, and a chain of command that had to keep functioning after the humiliation. He first looked to Major General Ernest Harmon, who had helped steady the line during the crisis. Harmon was respected, blunt, and physically present where the trouble was. But Harmon had already written a sharp assessment of Second Corps, and he did not want to profit from the report that condemned another man. He refused the job. That left one obvious solution, and one dangerous one. George S. Patton. Patton was not a quiet repair tool. He was speed, polish, temper, theater, and confidence compressed into a cavalryman's body. He had already handled command in Morocco during Operation Torch. Eisenhower knew his virtues. He also knew his risks. Patton could revive a beaten command. Patton could also make himself impossible. But Eisenhower was not looking for a comforting man. He was looking for a man who could change the temperature of Second Corps before the Germans touched it again. On March 5, 1943, Eisenhower flew forward to Tebessa and relieved Fredendall. He framed the change as reassignment, not public disgrace. Fredendall was sent back to the United States, where he would spend the rest of the war in training and stateside command roles. The Army did not stop to mourn the paperwork, because by March 6th, Patton was taking over Second Corps, and by March 7th, he was looking at what Kasserine had left behind. A battered corps, a suspicious staff, a damaged reputation, and an enemy that had already learned where to hit. Patton opened his diary and wrote that he was taking over rather a mess, but would make a go of it. That sentence was not dramatic. That was why it mattered. He did not write as if he were stepping onto a stage. He wrote like a man looking at a broken machine and deciding the first job was to get it moving again before arguing about who had cracked the casing. Eisenhower's instructions to Patton were simple in shape and heavy in meaning. Restore morale, win a battle, raise the reputation of American troops in British eyes. Then Eisenhower added the one thing Patton may have needed to hear more than an order. He did not have to prove his courage to Ike. That was not praise. It was permission. Eisenhower was telling him, I already know you are brave. Do not waste this command trying to perform bravery for me. Use it to repair the corps. For Patton, that was a cleared runway. He had rank. He had authority. He had trust. And he had almost no time. So he attacked the first thing he believed a beaten army could control: its bearing. The orders came fast. Helmets would be worn. Leggings would be fastened. Officers would wear neckties. Men old enough to shave would shave. Vehicles would be marked properly. Uniforms would be worn correctly. Sloppiness would cost money. To some officers, it looked petty. A corps had just been mauled by German armor, and Patton was talking about shaving and neckties. But Patton was not really talking about neckties. He was making a defeated formation perform a new identity with its hands. Every knot tied under the throat, every helmet buckled, Every boot laced, every uniform corrected. Each small action said the same thing. Kasserine is over. Bradley later understood the mechanism. The uniform rules were not a cure by themselves. They were a signal. The soldiers were being forced to feel, in the most physical way possible, that a different era had begun. A man can argue with a speech. It is harder to argue with a helmet on his head. Patton moved through the corps with visible energy. He inspected, he scolded, he corrected, he demanded reports. He pushed headquarters closer to the war's pulse. He made officers feel watched. He made soldiers feel seen, even when they hated being corrected. That was the difference between distance and presence. Fredendall's command had reached the front through coded language from a ravine. Patton's command reached it through dust, boots, voice, and pressure. And pressure was exactly what Second Corps needed, because the next test was already forming. The Americans could not simply look better. They had to fight better. Within days, Patton was preparing offensive operations in southern Tunisia. The target was Gafsa, but the deeper target was reputation. American troops had to show the Germans, the British, and themselves that Kasserine had not defined them. On March 17th, Second Corps moved. Gafsa fell back into American hands. The advance pushed toward Guettar, where the next proof would come in steel. 16 days after Patton took command, German armor struck again. This time, it was not at a corps still wandering through the fog of defeat. It was against American units that had been tightened, warned, and made to expect a test. On March 23, 1943, elements of the German 10th Panzer Division attacked near Guettar. The 1st Infantry Division and the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion held their ground against the assault. This was not the whole Tunisian campaign. It was not a perfect American victory in every sense. The fight around Guettar would continue. But the meaning of that first armored attack was unmistakable. The same army that had been driven back through Kasserine now stopped a major German armored blow. Not because uniforms defeat tanks, not because Patton's temper was a strategy, not because one general magically transformed every weakness, but because command had moved closer to reality. Orders sharpened, confidence returned. Units began to believe the man above them would demand much, but would also see what was happening. That belief changes how an army receives pressure. At Kasserine, pressure had scattered the corps. At Guettar, pressure began to harden it. Eisenhower noticed. From Algiers, he wrote with satisfaction about the 1st Infantry Division. The Germans, he believed, would learn to dislike that outfit. There was a quiet turn inside that line. Only weeks earlier, the question had been whether American ground forces were ready for the German army. Now Eisenhower was beginning to see the answer he needed. Not ready enough at Kasserine. Learning fast after it. Dangerous once properly led. That was the real transformation. The public story of Kasserine often becomes too simple. It becomes a story about green American troops being humiliated by veterans. There is truth in that, but not enough truth. The Americans were inexperienced. The Germans were skilled. The terrain was unforgiving. The Allied command system was awkward. But the decisive lesson was not that American soldiers could not fight. The lesson was that soldiers cannot compensate forever for confused command. A division cannot repair a corps commander's distance. A tank crew cannot fix strategic dispersion. A rifleman cannot decode a headquarters that does not speak clearly. And courage at the line does not erase hesitation behind it. Eisenhower's strength in that moment was not that he had avoided failure. He had not. His strength was that he did not let failure become fog. He identified the part that could be changed before the next fight, and he changed it. That is harder than it sounds, because every institution protects itself after embarrassment. It searches for softer words. It calls collapse a setback. It calls command failure a coordination problem. It turns one man's removal into a committee's lesson. Eisenhower did some of that in public because he had to manage a coalition. But privately and operationally, he acted. Fredendall went out. Patton went in. Bradley stayed close. The Corps moved forward, and the war moved with it. By May 13, 1943, Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian troops went into captivity in Tunisia. The campaign that had exposed American weakness in February ended with Allied victory in May. 3 months. That was the distance between Kasserine and surrender. But the most revealing distance was shorter. From March 6th to March 23rd, 17 days between Patton taking command and American troops standing against German armor at Guettar. That does not mean Patton alone won North Africa. He did not. It does not mean discipline rules are a universal answer to every broken unit. They are not. And it does not mean Fredendall caused every failure in Tunisia. The Allied command structure itself had serious problems. But history is often decided by whether a commander can recognize the one failure that cannot be allowed to remain. At Kasserine, that failure was distance. Distance from the front. Distance from subordinates. Distance from clear orders. Distance from the reality soldiers were dying inside. Patton's correction was not gentle, and it was not purely tactical. It was physical. He closed distance by appearing, demanding, inspecting, and forcing the Corps to feel that command had returned to the ground. Years later, Eisenhower would write that for the particular task Patton had been given, he had no superior in the army. That was not casual praise. Eisenhower was careful with words. He knew Patton's flaws too well to worship him. But for that moment, with that Corps, after that defeat, Patton was the instrument Eisenhower needed. A beaten army did not need comfort first. It needed evidence that someone had taken hold of it. The officers felt it. The soldiers felt it. The enemy soon felt it. And the British, watching closely, had to begin adjusting their judgment of the Americans. Kasserine remained a scar. Nothing about Guettar erased the dead, the captured, or the men who had marched backward through dust and fear while their commanders struggled to understand the battle. But scars can become maps if a commander is honest enough to read them. Eisenhower read Kasserine and saw that the American army was not doomed by its soldiers. It was endangered by the wrong kind of command. Patton read the same scar and saw that morale was not an abstract word. It lived in posture, movement, speech, and the belief that the man giving orders was close enough to know what his orders cost. That is why the story of Kasserine does not end at the pass. It ends weeks later, when a corps that had been driven backward stood in the path of German armor and did not break the same way again. The mountain headquarters became a warning. The relief of Fredendall became a decision. Patton's arrival became a shock. Guettar became proof. And Eisenhower's real victory in that crisis was not pretending the defeat had been smaller than it was. It was understanding that an army can survive a bad battle. But it cannot survive a commander who stays 70 miles from the truth.